The Canon 10D was released back in 2003. Now, at the time, this cost around $2,000. Nowadays, you can find this used for about $50. So just what do you get with this 19-year-old DSLR? Well, there's a 6.3 megapixel CMOS sensor, 7 autofocus points with 1 center cross type, and a 1.8-inch 118K LCD screen. Build quality of the 10D is absolutely phenomenal. You know, you got to remember that back then, Canon was still treating the XXD line as a semi-professional line. You know, it wasn't until 2011 with the Canon 60D that it started switching over to that sort of plasticky nonsense. Back in these days, everything was just a really solid magnesium alloy. You know, for just a regular DSLR, this thing's got some real weight to it. The other thing that I find absolutely fascinating about the 10D, if you're a fan of trivia like me, the Canon 10D is the only Canon camera to have the logo on the wrong side of the camera. You know, nothing in the XXD line, nothing in like the T2i, Digital Rebel line, nothing in the Professional 5D Mark whatever line. All of them have the logo over here on the left side. The 10D, one of the only cameras, if not the only Canon camera to have the logo over there on the right side by the grip. In terms of shutter speed, the 10D goes up to 1/4000th of a second. Now, admittedly, it would have been nice to see it go up to 1/8000th of a second. And in terms of flash sync speed, it does up to 1/200th of a second. And as far as burst rate goes, you've got 3 frames a second up to 9 frames. So maybe not your ideal sports camera. In terms of lens mount, the 10D is the only camera in the XXD lineup that's EF only. You know, it's kind of ironic because this came out in 2003 and the EFS mount was also invented in 2003. In that year, the 300D was the first camera to actually use the EFS mount. And then just a year later in 2004, the 20D would also adopt the EFS mount. But unfortunately with the 10D, you're just kind of stuck with EF lenses, which that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot of great EF lenses. The problem is EF lenses are kind of geared towards full frame cameras. So you can't really find like a cheap kit lens for the 10D. You know, for a lot of this review, I've been using this old Canon 28-70 EF lens, and you can just kind of tell by the focal length that it's made for, well, it's made for film cameras, but also made for just full frame sensors. Yes, there are lenses like the 16-35 or the 17-40, but those are both really expensive lenses, and so you're not really going to find any traditional like 18-55 millimeter kit lens for the 10D. Don't get me wrong, there's still a ton of wide angle options. It's not hard to find like wide angle lenses for this camera. What is hard to find is a zoom lens that has the traditional range of an APS-C size camera's kit lens. The LCD screen on the 10D is pretty common for DSLRs of that era. You know, it's that 1.8-inch 118K dot screen. Not great by modern standards, but you know, for someone like me who was still shooting film back then at that time, it was just a delight to be able to actually see the image on the camera instead of having to wait until your negatives and your pictures were actually developed. Having said that, I will say it's kind of hard to judge exposure by the LCD screen on this camera because it's so different based on what angle you're looking at. For example, if you have the camera slightly tilted up, the screen is unusually bright and it's really hard to see, so everything looks overexposed. But then if you tilt it slightly downward, the screen gets really dark and everything looks super underexposed. You know, you gotta kind of find that sweet spot, like right in the middle. Autofocus on the 10D has been kind of a pleasant surprise. You know, for a 19-year-old camera with only 7 autofocus points, it's been pretty accurate. And I mean, this lens that I've been using the majority of the time was made for Canon film cameras. This actually predates the 10D by about 10 years. And even with that, still been pretty good. Now, in terms of image quality, the 10D is actually really solid. You know, admittedly, it only has that 6 megapixel sensor, so you're probably not looking at this for professional work. You know, you're probably not looking for a $50 19-year-old DSLR so that you can shoot a billboard or the cover of Vogue magazine, but for normal people, for people who actually just like photography and just like sharing the occasional picture on social media, images from the 10D are actually really good. The other thing that surprised me about the 10D is I took it out the other night and shot everything at ISO 1600, just walking around, typical nighttime photo shoot, and it actually had pretty decent low light performance. You know, like I say, everything's shot at ISO 1600, and when I looked in those shadows, it all looks pretty clean. Overall, I've been really impressed with the images coming out of the 10D. So of course, that begs the obvious question, is the 10D worth it in 2022? And I mean, yeah, definitely. It's a $50 DSLR that has basically semi-professional build quality. It has great image quality. It does pretty well in low light. The autofocus is decent, and it's just a really good user experience overall. You know, I gotta be honest, like I got my 10D back in 2012, and for the past 10 years, it just kind of sat on the shelf. Basically, in the entire time that I've had it, it's gotten the most use this past week just making this video. And I gotta say, it's like, I feel bad that it sat on the shelf so long. I should have been using this camera all the time. But I guess that's just sort of the nature of being a camera collector with way too many cameras. You know, the 10D is still such a solid workhorse of a camera. Like I say, you know, you're probably not using it for professional work, but just for your personal life, this camera is more than enough. You know, take this with you on vacation, take this with you to your kids' sporting events, take this with you, you know, family gatherings, wherever, whatever. You're gonna get good images from this camera. You know, overall, you won't be disappointed. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.